Hello, this is Chapter 5, Historical Foundations of U.S. Education, by me, Melissa Espinoza. Why the history is important to review. First, knowledge of the events that have influenced our schools will help more effectively evaluate current proposals for change. And second, awareness of events that have influenced teaching is a hallmark of professionalism in education. Modern education is influenced by early European education, most notably by ancient Greece and Rome. The goal of Greek education was the well-rounded development of mind and body. Three important players at the time were Socrates, who questioned his pupils in a manner that led them to see errors and inconsistencies in their thinking, a student and disciple of Socrates, Plato, that believed that the individual's abilities should be developed through education for the good of society, and Aristotle, Plato's most famous student, who was a realist and believed that reality, knowledge, and value exist in the physical world independent of the mind. In 146 BC, Greece was conquered by the Roman army. The Roman school system consisted of the ludus, or elementary school, and a secondary or grammar school. Upper-class boys attended grammar schools where they studied Greek or Latin grammar and literature. Boys aged 16 to 20 attended the School of Rhetoric. The Middle Ages instruction consisted of the study of ancient classical literature, particularly the works of Plato and Aristotle. The ideal curriculum of the time was based on the 7 liberal arts, the trivium of grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music. The Reformation, with its questioning of religious doctrines, revived interest in the scientific understanding of nature. The 18th century came to be known as the Age of Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason, because reasoning and scientific inquiry were being used to improve society. Colonial curriculum stressed religious objectives above all. The primary objective of elementary schooling was to learn to read so that one might read the Bible and religious catechisms. Teachers at the time needed minimal qualifications and worked for little pay. Their status was relatively low. Teaching was shadowed by what was seen as the real work of the community, farming. Dame schools were also provided at the time, which provided initial instruction for boys and were often the only schooling for girls. These schools were run by widows or housewives in their homes and were supported by modest fees from parents. At reading and writing schools, boys received an education that went beyond what their parents could teach them at home or what they could learn at dame schools. The Boston Latin School was founded in 1635 to provide pre-college education for the new country's future leaders, as well as universal compulsory education, which had its origins in the Massachusetts Act of 1642, which was viewed by some as the first school law in the colonies. Prior to this date, parents could decide whether they wished for their children to be educated at home or at a school. Education during this period moved away from Eurocentric ideals, and several schools were founded by leaders such as Benjamin Franklin, Sarah Pierce, Thomas Jefferson, and Noah Webster. Benjamin Franklin designed and promoted the Philadelphia Academy, a private secondary school which opened in 1751. Franklin's proposals for educating youth called for a wide range of subjects that emphasized the classics as well as practical knowledge and skills. Sarah Pierce began her academy in the dining room of her home with 2 students. Eventually, the academy grew to 140 female students from nearly every state and from Canada. Thomas Jefferson proposed to the Virginia legislature in 1779 with his bill for more general diffusion of knowledge. This plan called for state-controlled elementary schools that would teach, with no cost to parents, 3 years of reading, writing, and arithmetic to all white children. In addition, 20 state grammar schools would be created in which selected poor students would be taught free for a maximum period of 6 years. Noah Webster first introduced his speller in 1783 under the title A Grammatical Institute for the English Language. Common schools are free state-supported schools that serve all students, and were first established in 1821. Horace Mann is best known as the champion of the common schools movement, which has led to free, public, locally controlled elementary schools we know today. In 1837, Mann accepted the position of Secretary of Massachusetts State Board of Education. Teachers, he felt, needed more than a high school education to teach, and they should be trained in professional programs. It was also during this time that the first recorded official ground for school segregation that dates back to the decision of the Massachusetts Supreme Court in 1850, where equal but separate schools were being provided. Education laws made it mandatory for all students to attend school, which increased attendance and helped establish better education standards for African American students and kindergarten. In 1869 through 1870, only 64.7% of 5 to 17-year-olds attended public school. In 2006 to 2007, it hiked up to 92.8%. After founding the first kindergarten in 1837, German educator Friedrich Froebel developed child-centered curriculum materials that were used in kindergartens in the United States and throughout the world. After the Civil War and Emancipation, schools for former slaves were opened throughout the South by African American communities. Approximately 500 of these schools operated in the South shortly after the war ended. Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau to provide the foundations for education for former slaves. It was also during this time that the National Education Association was founded in 1857, as well as the American Federation of Teachers, founded in 1916. The NEA also appointed its Committee of 10 in 1892 and its Committee of 15 in 1893 to make recommendations for secondary and elementary curricula, respectively. Women became influential in shaping education policies during the time, in part through the women's suffragette movement, which led to the right to vote, and figures such as Ella Flagg Young, superintendent of Chicago schools from 1909 to 1915, Catherine Gogan and Margaret Haley, leaders of Chicago Teachers Federation, and Jane Addams, who founded Hull House, a social and educational center for poor immigrants. From the end of World War I to the end of World War II, education in the U.S. was influenced significantly by the philosophy of progressivism. Progressivism is a philosophical orientation based on the belief that life is evolving in a positive direction, that people should be trusted to act in their own best interest, and that education should focus on children's interests and practical needs. Teachers in progressive schools functioned as guides and first engaged students through providing activities related to their natural interest, and then they moved students to a higher level of understanding. And John Dewey and his wife established the Laboratory School for testing progressive principles in the classroom. This school opened in 1896, and the children learned traditional subjects by working cooperatively in small groups on projects such as cooking, weaving, carpentry, sewing, and metalwork. By the start of World War II, the progressive education movement was faced with rising public criticism and began rapid decline. In 1955, the Progressive Education Association ceased operation. The diversity of America's school population also increased, with Latin Americans, Eastern and Southern Europeans that followed waves of immigrants such as the Irish and Germans. World War II also created conditions that led the federal government to fund several educational programs. Among these was the Lanham Act and the GI Bill, which provided with millions of veterans with payments for tuition and room and board at colleges and universities. World War II also saw the beginning of school desegregation, and on May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court rejected the separate but equal doctrine that had been used since 1850. The war on poverty also developed methods and programs such as subsidized breakfast and lunch programs, Head Start, Upward Bound, and the Job Corps that would be appropriate for children who had been disadvantaged due to poverty. The reforms of the 1960s and 70s resulted in more young people graduating from high school than in previous decades, more teachers having advanced training, school buildings being better equipped, and instructional methods and materials being more relevant to learners. Title IV of the Educational Amendments Act was also taken effect in 1975 that stated no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act was also passed during this time. Education focuses more on increasing diversity and closing the achievement gap, which can still be seen between white students and their Hispanic, Black, and American Indian peers, and methods to promote excellence using Common Core standards, and holding schools, teachers, and administrators accountable for student learning and technology integration. Many challenges in the U.S. education system, it still strives for the excellence and success of all its students. And as we move forward, we must remember the past, but work for a better future. Thank you for listening.